Come closer, traveler, but steel yourself, for tonight's tale reveals that some knowledge comes with a price that no scholar should have to pay. The voice that speaks to you belongs to one who has sat in libraries where shadows move independently of their sources, where ancient texts pulse with malevolent life, and where the pursuit of understanding leads to discoveries that challenge the very foundations of civilization. This chronicle unfolds in the restricted halls of Candlekeep, where stone walls bear the scars of experiments gone wrong, and the air itself seems thick with accumulated secrets too dangerous for common understanding. It is a tale of translation work that begins as pure scholarship, but transforms into something far more sinister, where clinical language disguises processes of unimaginable horror, and where the realization dawns that ancient evils have been hiding in plain sight for millennia. Prepare yourself for the kind of knowledge that corrupts even as it enlightens, friend, as I share the scholar's discovery, a story of instruction manuals masquerading as mythology, of systematic infiltration spanning centuries, and of the moment when academic curiosity becomes a weapon in humanity's struggle against an ancient and patient evil that has been reshaping the world from within. The restricted section of Candlekeep's library was not a place where casual researchers were welcome. Its ancient corridors protected by wards that could reduce unauthorized visitors to piles of ash before they realized they had crossed forbidden thresholds. The very air here seemed thick with accumulated knowledge, as if centuries of scholarly pursuit had saturated the atmosphere with the weight of secrets too dangerous for common understanding. Stone walls that had stood for millennia bore the scars of magical experiments gone wrong, while the floors showed the careful patterns of protective circles that had been carved by scribes who understood that some knowledge required physical barriers as well as intellectual preparation. Chronicler Kazra Truthseeker had earned access to these forbidden halls through years of patient scholarship and demonstrated discretion. Her reputation for rigorous research and ethical conduct opening doors that remained sealed to most visitors who sought the treasures of Candlekeep's collection. Her current project, translating fragments of pre-imperial draconic texts, had seemed like pure academic exercise when she began it 6 months ago. A chance to contribute to the understanding of ancient magical theory while pursuing her passion for linguistic archaeology and the reconstruction of lost civilizations. But as she sat in her assigned study chamber, surrounded by manuscripts whose age could be measured in millennia and whose very existence challenged conventional understanding of how knowledge was preserved across the ages, Kazra felt a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with the chamber's perpetual twilight or the way shadows seemed to move independently of their sources. The texts spread before her were not the historical documents or mythological accounts she had initially believed them to be, based on the catalogue descriptions and the preliminary translations that had attracted her attention to this particular collection. They were instruction manuals, detailed guides for rituals that could fundamentally alter the relationship between dragons and the material plane itself. Techniques that went far beyond anything a conventional magic theory suggested was possible. The implications of what she was reading challenged not just her understanding of draconic magic, but her fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality and the forces that shaped the world in which she lived. The parchment beneath her fingers was made from dragonhide, its surface bearing the subtle scale patterns that marked it as having come from an ancient worm of considerable power. The age of the material was evident not just in its physical appearance, but in the way it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, as if the very substance of the parchment had been changed by exposure to magical forces beyond mortal comprehension. The ink had been mixed with substances that her scholarly training told her were best left unidentified, while the binding threads gleamed with metallic sheen that suggested the incorporation of precious metals into their construction. This was not a book in a conventional sense. It was an artifact, a repository of knowledge that had been designed to survive the fall of civilizations and the passage of ages that would reduce ordinary texts to dust. The care with which it had been constructed spoke of knowledge that its creators considered precious beyond any material treasure, worth preserving at any cost and by any means necessary. "The Crimson Codex of Eternal Binding," she read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper in the chamber's oppressive silence. The title page bore illustrations that seemed to move when viewed peripherally, depicting scenes of transformation and transcendence that made her stomach turn with their implications. Dragons soaring through skies that burned with unnatural fire, mortals kneeling before altars where the boundaries between flesh and scale had become meaningless, cities rising from landscapes that bore no resemblance to any earthly terrain. What she had taken for metaphorical language about the return of the Great Mother was actually precise technical documentation for summoning procedures that predated most known magical theory. The clinical detail with which the text described the preparation of vessels worthy to house divinity made her hands shake as she translated passage after passage of instructions that read like recipes for the systematic destruction of human consciousness. "To prepare the mortal frame for divine habitation," one section began, its language deceptively clinical as something that described processes of unimaginable horror. "The practitioner must first understand that the boundaries between self and other are illusions maintained by insufficient spiritual development. Through careful application of the techniques described herein, these boundaries may be dissolved, allowing the subject to achieve perfect unity with the Dragon Queen's eternal will." The euphemistic language could not disguise what the text was actually describing: a process for breaking down individual personality and replacing it with something that served the cult's purposes. Each step was laid out with scientific precision, from the initial psychological conditioning that made subjects receptive to influence through the magical procedures that altered their brain chemistry, to the final rituals that left them as hollow shells capable of housing fragments of Tiamat's consciousness. Kazra forced herself to continue reading, even as her academic training warred with her human instinct to flee from knowledge that should never have been preserved. The text described variations of the process for different types of subjects, adjusting the techniques based on species, magical aptitude, and psychological profile. Elves required different handling than humans, while those with natural resistance to mental influence needed additional preparation before the transformation could be completed. But it was the section on optimal subject selection that truly made her blood run cold. The text provided detailed criteria for identifying individuals who would make the most effective vessels, prioritizing not just magical potential, but social position, family connections, and access to positions of authority. The cult was not randomly converting whoever they could capture. They were systematically targeting people whose transformation would give them influence over entire communities. "Leaders and influencers are preferred," the text explained, with the same clinical detachment it had shown throughout. "A single converted authority figure can achieve more than dozens of ordinary subjects, as their transformed state will be interpreted by others as legitimate policy changes, rather than signs of supernatural influence. The key is to select individuals whose personality changes will seem to be natural evolution, rather than external manipulation." The implications were staggering. The cult had been using these techniques not for centuries, but for millennia, gradually infiltrating positions of power throughout the known world. How many kings and queens, how many high priests and archmages, how many merchant princes and military commanders had been transformed into unwitting servants of the Dragon Queen? How many of the political and social changes that scholars attributed to natural historical forces had actually been the result of this systematic corruption? Kazra's research had always been motivated by the belief that understanding the past could help illuminate the present. But now, she wondered if that understanding might come at too high a price. The knowledge contained in these texts were not just dangerous, it was actively corrupting, designed to plant seeds of doubt and temptation in anyone who studied it too closely. She could feel it working on her own mind, offering rationalizations for techniques that part of her found fascinating despite their obvious evil. As if summoned by her thoughts, a soft voice spoke from the shadows near the chamber's entrance. "Fascinating reading, I trust?" Kazra spun in her chair to see a figure she had not heard enter, a tall woman in the grey robes of a senior Candlekeep scholar. The newcomer's face was pleasant but unremarkable, the kind of appearance that would be forgotten moments after a casual encounter. But her eyes held depths that spoke of knowledge accumulated over far longer than any human lifetime, and when she moved, it was with the fluid grace that marked her as something more than she appeared to be. "Keeper Miirym," Kazra said, recognizing the dragon who maintained Candlekeep's most dangerous collections in human form. "I didn't hear you approach." "Few people do," Miirym replied, with a smile that revealed teeth just slightly too sharp for human anatomy. "I make it a point to check on researchers who delve too deeply into materials that might prove influential. How are you finding the Crimson Codex?" "Disturbing," Kazra answered honestly, gesturing towards the open manuscript with its pages covered in her translation notes and cross-references to contemporary sources. "And enlightening in ways I'm not sure I want to be enlightened. This isn't just ancient history. These techniques are being used today, aren't they?" "What makes you think that?" Miirym answered, settling into the chamber's other chair with casual grace that nevertheless suggested she was prepared for any reaction her presence might provoke. Kazra gestured toward the manuscript, its pages covered with her careful annotations and the growing network of connections she had discovered between ancient techniques and modern events. "The level of detail, the systematic approach, the way it anticipates and addresses every possible variable. This isn't theoretical research. It's a field manual that has been refined through centuries of practical application." Miirym nodded approvingly, moving closer to examine Kazra's work with the eye of someone who had seen the original techniques being developed and understood their implications better than any mortal scholar could. "You have excellent instincts for textual analysis. Yes, these methods are very much in use today. The cult of the dragon has had centuries to perfect them, and they've shown considerable innovation in adapting ancient principles to modern circumstances." "Then why is this knowledge preserved here?" Kazra asked, her voice carrying the confusion and moral uncertainty that had been building as she worked through the implications of her discoveries. "Why risk allowing anyone to study techniques that could be used to cause such harm?" "Because knowledge denied is knowledge lost," Miirym replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had lived through the rise and fall of civilizations and understood the long-term consequences of decisions that seemed simple in the short term. "And knowledge lost can be rediscovered by those with fewer scruples about its application. Better to preserve dangerous knowledge under controlled conditions than to allow it to be reconstructed by those who would use it without wisdom." The dragon's logic was sound, but it raised uncomfortable questions about Kazra's own role in the process. By translating and analyzing these texts, was she not making them more accessible to exactly the kind of people who should never have access to them? How could she ensure that her research would be used to counter the cult's activities rather than enhance them? "Your concerns are written clearly on your face," Miirym observed with amusement, her ancient eyes seeing through the careful scholarly composure that Kazra had cultivated over years of academic training. "You're wondering whether your work serves the cause of knowledge or the cause of evil. It's a question that every scholar who delves into dangerous materials must answer for themselves." "What's your answer?" Kazra asked, genuinely curious to hear the perspective of someone who had been grappling with these questions for centuries. "That knowledge is neither good nor evil, it simply is," Miirym replied, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who tested this philosophy against the harsh realities of a world where power was often misused. "What matters is how it's used, and by whom. The techniques described in that codex can be used to transform willing subjects into servants of tyranny, yes, but they can also be understood well enough to be countered, to be recognized when they're being used, to be defended against by those who know what to look for." Miirym gestured toward another manuscript that lay unopened on Kazra's research table, its binding bearing symbols that suggested it contained knowledge of a very different sort. That volume contains accounts of the same techniques being used by good-aligned organizations to heal mental trauma and restore damaged minds. The difference lies not in the methods themselves, but in the purposes they serve and the consent of those affected. Kazra opened the second manuscript with careful hands, finding page after page of case studies that described the restoration of individuals who had been damaged by various forms of mental influence. The techniques were recognizably similar to those described in the Crimson Codex, but they had been modified to enhance rather than suppress individual consciousness, to heal rather than corrupt, to restore free will rather than eliminate it. This is why we preserve dangerous knowledge, Miirym continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone who is sharing hard-won wisdom. Not to enable its misuse, but to ensure that those who oppose such misuse have the tools that they need to be effective. Your translation work is creating a resource that could be invaluable to healers and protectors who encounter the cult's victims. The conversation continued deep into the night, with Miirym providing context and guidance that helped Kazra understand not just what the text said, but how they fit into the broader pattern of the cult's activities. The ancient dragon had lived through periods when these techniques had been used on a massive scale, and her first-hand accounts added depth and nuance to Kazra's academic understanding that no amount of scholarly research could have provided. The current cult leadership represents the most sophisticated application of these methods in recorded history, Miirym explained, as they studied a particularly complex diagram that showed the magical connections between transformed subjects and their controlling consciousness. They've learned to create networks of influence that span entire continents, with each converted individual serving as both a source of information and a conduit for further conversion. How many people are we talking about? Kazra asked, though she dreaded the answer that her research was already beginning to suggest. Unknown, but the estimates range from hundreds to thousands of individuals in positions of significant authority, Miirym replied, her voice carrying the kind of clinical assessment that came from long experience with such matters. The beauty of this system, from the cult's perspective, is that most of the subjects don't know they've been converted. They continue to behave according to their original personalities in most circumstances, with the alterations only becoming apparent when issues related to the cult's interests arise. The scope of the infiltration was breathtaking in its audacity and terrifying in its implications. If Miirym's estimates were accurate, then the cult had effectively placed agents at every level of society throughout the known world, creating a shadow network of influence that could be activated whenever the plan required it. The democratic institutions and commercial organizations that most people trusted to protect their interests might already be compromised in ways that would make resistance almost impossible. Is there a way to detect the conversion process? Kazra asked, hoping that her research might provide some defense against techniques that seemed almost impossible to counter. Some kind of magical signature or behavioral pattern that would reveal when someone has been affected? Several, actually, Miirym replied, producing a leather-bound journal filled with her own observations and experiments. But they require either intimate knowledge of the subject's original personality or access to magical detection methods that are beyond most people's capabilities. The cult has been very careful to make their work as invisible as possible. As dawn broke over Candlekeep, casting long shadows through the chamber's narrow windows, Kazra found herself facing a decision that would determine the course of her remaining research. She could continue her translation work, knowing that it would contribute to the understanding of techniques that were being used to threaten everything she valued. Or she could abandon the project, leaving the knowledge locked away where it could not be misused, but also could not be used to help the cult's victims. What would you do? She asked Miirym, as they prepared to conclude their session. I would remember that knowledge is a tool, and like any tool, its value depends on the skill and wisdom of those who wield it. You have both skill and wisdom, Chronicler Truthseeker. I trust you to use what you learn in service of the light rather than the darkness. The compliment was meaningful, coming from someone who had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, but it also carried with it a weight of responsibility that Kazra felt settling on her shoulders like a mantle she had not asked to wear. Her scholarly pursuits had always seemed safely removed from the conflicts that shaped the world, but now she understood that knowledge itself could be a weapon in the struggle between good and evil. Over the following weeks, Kazra threw herself into her work with renewed purpose, driven by the understanding that every page she translated might contain information that could save lives or prevent atrocities. The Crimson Codex revealed its secrets slowly, each section requiring careful cross-referencing with other sources to ensure accurate translation and proper context. But as her understanding of the cult's methods deepened, so did her awareness of how those methods were being applied to the world beyond Candlekeep's walls. News reports of political figures making unexpected policy changes, accounts of religious leaders preaching doctrines that seemed inconsistent with their previous beliefs, stories of merchants and military commanders making decisions that served no apparent rational purpose. All of these began to take on sinister new meanings when viewed through the lens of what she had learned from the ancient texts. The cult was not preparing for some distant apocalypse. They were actively reshaping the world in preparation for their goddess's return, using techniques that had been perfected over millennia to turn the existing power structure against themselves. By the time their final ritual was ready, they would not need to conquer the world. They would already control it, through the minds and hearts of those who thought they were making their own decisions. Kazra's final report, when she completed it after 3 months of intense research, was a document that could change how the forces of good understand and responded to the cult's threat. But it was also a document that could cause immense harm if it fell into the wrong hands, providing a roadmap for psychological manipulation techniques that could be used by any organization with sufficient resources and lack of scruples. As she sealed the report in the special containers that Candlekeep used for its most sensitive materials, Kazra reflected on the strange journey that had brought her from simple academic curiosity to involvement in a conflict that would determine the fate of civilization itself. The scholar's life was supposed to be one of contemplation and discovery, but sometimes discovery led to responsibilities that no amount of contemplation could avoid. The knowledge she had uncovered would soon be shared with those who had the power and authority to act upon it. But whether they would be able to use it effectively remained to be seen. The cult had centuries of experience in applying these techniques, while those who opposed them were only beginning to understand what they faced. But knowledge, as Miirym had reminded her, was a powerful weapon when wielded with wisdom and purpose. The Crimson Codex and its companions had revealed their secrets to someone who would use that knowledge to protect rather than exploit, to heal rather than harm, to defend the light rather than serve the darkness. The scholar's discovery had become the foundation for resistance against an ancient evil, and in the quiet chambers of Candlekeep, the first moves had been made in a war that would be fought not with swords and spells, but with understanding and the courage to act upon that understanding when action was needed most. And so, this tale draws to a close. Though its echoes may linger in your dreams, the fire burns lower now. But don't despair. I've countless more stories waiting to be shared with you. If this tale stirred something within you, if it reminded you why magic still matters in this mundane world, then please, light your own beacon. That glowing thumbs up tells the spirits of story that our fellowship grows stronger. Subscribe to join our circle permanently and ring that notification bell. That way, you'll know the moment I return with new chronicles. The fire burns brightest when more souls gather around it. Wouldn't you agree? Now, if that's the case, share this tale with another weary soul who needs it, reminding them that adventure still exists. Tag a friend who would appreciate a good story by the fire. The more who believe, the more real these worlds become. And if you're new to our hearth, explore the playlist of chronicles that I've gathered. Tales of heroes and villains, love and loss, magic and mystery. Each one carefully chosen for souls like yours. Until the fire calls us together again. May your adventures be worthy of legend, and may you never lose the wonder that brought you here tonight. Travel or sleep well, brave soul. The long rest awaits your return.